The cold was a thief. It stole the feeling from her fingers, the strength from her legs, the breath from her lungs. Ilara huddled deeper into the hollow of a great fallen oak, pulling the threadbare remnants of her cloak around her shoulders. It did nothing. The damp chill of the forest floor had already claimed her, seeping into her bones with the patient certainty of death. She was used to the cold. She had been born to it, it seemed. The cold of a loveless home, the cold of a father's hand, the cold of the iron brand that marked her forever as less than nothing. The searing memory of it, a white-hot agony on the soft skin below her collarbone, was almost a comfort now. It was the only warmth she had ever truly known. Her crime had been a simple one. She had been born a girl when her father had needed a son to carry his failing name. Her true transgression, however, was witnessing his treachery, the quiet poison he slipped into the chalice of a visiting lord. He had seen her see him. The next day, the brand for a common thief was pressed to her skin, and she was cast out. A convenient lie to cover an inconvenient truth. So she ran. She ran until her legs gave out, until her lungs burned, until the world was a smear of green and gray. She ran into the King's Wood, a place every villager feared, a place ruled by a sovereign who was more myth than man. They said he was ancient, that his heart was made of the same winter ice that capped the northern peaks year-round. They called him the Alpha King, and they whispered that a beast walked in his shadow. Ilara didn't believe in beasts. She believed in the sharp, immediate reality of starvation and the slow, creeping reality of freezing to death. A tremor shook her, a violent, rattling convulsion that had nothing to do with the cold. It was hunger. Her stomach was a hollow, aching void. She pressed a hand against it, a useless gesture. She had not eaten in 3 days. The handful of winter berries she had found yesterday had only made the ache worse. She curled into a tighter ball, resting her cheek against the damp, mossy bark. Perhaps this was it. Perhaps this was how her story ended. Not with a bang, not even with a whimper, but with a slow, silent fade into the frozen earth. It was a pathetic end for a pathetic life. A sound broke the stillness, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the very ground she lay on. It was not the sound of a wolf. She had heard wolves, yipping and howling in the distance. This was deeper, heavier. It was a sound of profound pain. Fear, sharp and electric, lanced through the fog of her exhaustion. She froze, every muscle screaming, the stories, the beast. Another sound followed the growl, a ragged, wet cough, and then a pained groan that was undeniably human. Curiosity was a dangerous luxury, one she could not afford. She should stay hidden. She should make herself smaller, disappear. But the sound came again, a raw note of suffering that plucked at a forgotten string deep inside her. It was the sound she herself had made, stifled into a pillow, the night the branding iron had cooled. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up. Her limbs were stiff, her joints screaming in protest. Using the fallen log for support, she peered over the top. Not 20 paces away, half hidden by ferns and shadows, was a dilapidated stone structure. It might have been a hunter's outpost once, but now the roof had caved in on one side, and ivy choked the walls. The door hung from a single hinge, a dark mouth gaping open. The sounds were coming from inside. She should run. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to turn and flee in the opposite direction, but her feet remained rooted to the spot. That sound of pain held her captive. She knew that sound. She lived with that sound. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she began to move. Each step was a deliberate act of will, a battle against the terror that clawed at her throat. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of slick leaves and hidden roots. She moved with the silence of a creature who had spent a lifetime trying to be invisible. The air grew colder as she approached the ruin, a strange, unnatural cold that had nothing to do with the winter air. It clung to the stone, radiating out in waves. It felt like walking into a cellar in the dead of winter. She paused at the broken doorway, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She peered into the gloom. At the center of the single circular room was a man. He was collapsed on the floor, propped against the crumbling stone of a central hearth. He was massive, a giant of a man with shoulders as broad as the door she stood in. A wild tangle of dark hair, streaked with silver, fell across his face. He was dressed in what might have been fine leathers and furs, now torn and matted with dirt, and something dark that could only be blood. One of his legs was twisted at an unnatural angle. A crude splint of wood and leather had been tied around his thigh, but it was soaked through with blood. He was shivering, but not from the chill in the air. It was a deep, violent tremor that racked his entire body, a fever shake that spoke of a poison or a deep infection. He was dying. As she watched, he let out another of those low, pained growls, and his head lolled to the side. For the first time, she saw his face clearly. It was a face carved from granite, all harsh lines and sharp angles. A face of brutal, breathtaking beauty. A thick, dark beard covered his jaw, but it couldn't hide the aristocratic line of his cheekbones or the firm set of his mouth, now slack with pain. And then his eyes flickered open. They were not the eyes of a man. They were the color of molten gold, glowing with a faint feral light in the gloom. They fixed on her, and the growl in his chest deepened, a warning rumble that shook the very air. This was the beast from the stories. She was sure of it. Terror seized her. She took a step back, her foot catching on a loose stone. She stumbled, crying out as she fell hard against the doorframe. The man, the beast, tried to push himself up, a snarl twisting his lips, but a wave of agony washed over him. He collapsed back against the hearth, his eyes squeezing shut as a strangled cry of pain escaped him. In that moment, the terror receded, replaced by a wave of something else. Pity. Empathy. He was not a monster hunting her. He was a wounded animal, trapped and in pain. She knew what it was to be wounded and alone. She stayed where she was for a long moment, her breath pluming in the unnaturally cold air. He did not move again. His breathing was shallow, ragged. He was slipping away. She could leave him. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. He was a stranger, and a dangerous one at that. But to leave him here to die felt like a betrayal of her own survival. It felt like leaving a part of herself to perish in the cold. Slowly, she got to her feet. She took a tentative step into the room. His eyes snapped open again, the golden light within them sharp and wary. He watched her every move, his body tense. "I'm not going to hurt you," she whispered. Her voice was a rusty croak. A low growl was her only answer. She held up her hands, showing they were empty. "You're hurt, let me help." She took another step. He flinched, trying to drag himself away, the movement sending fresh waves of pain through him. "Stay still," she said, her voice a little firmer now. "You'll only make it worse." She moved with painstaking slowness, circling around him to get a better look at his leg. The wound was bad, a deep gash, crusted with dried blood and dirt. The flesh around it was red and swollen. The fever was from the infection. If it wasn't cleaned, he would lose the leg if he didn't die first. There was a small, smoldering fire in the hearth, more smoke than flame. He must have built it before he collapsed. She needed water, and clean cloth, and herbs, if she could find any. "I'll be right back," she said, her voice soft. "I'm just going to get some water." He watched her with those burning gold eyes, his expression unreadable. She wasn't sure he even understood her, but he didn't try to stop her as she backed out of the ruin. Outside, the world seemed both sharper and more distant. She had a purpose now, a focus that pushed aside the hunger and the cold. She found a stream not far away. its water running clear and icy. She cupped her hands, drinking deeply before looking for something to carry water in. She found an old leather pouch on his discarded pack, rinsing it out again and again until it was clean. She filled it with water and then searched the forest floor for what she needed: yarrow to stop the bleeding, the broad leaves of a plantain weed to draw out the infection. She was no healer, but she had learned what she could from the village wise woman before she was cast out, trading chores for lessons. When she returned, he was in the same position, his eyes closed. For a terrifying moment she thought he had died, but as she knelt beside him, she saw the faint rise and fall of his chest. "I'm back," she whispered. His eyes opened. The golden glow was dimmer now, clouded with pain. She laid out her meager supplies on the stone floor. "This is going to hurt," she said, more to herself than to him. She started with the splint. The leather ties were soaked and stiff. Her numb fingers fumbled with the knots. He hissed in a sharp breath as she jostled his leg, but he did not move, did not growl. He just watched her, his jaw tight. When the splint was finally off, she had to bite her lip to keep from gasping. The wound was worse than she had thought. It was a deep, jagged tear, as if he had been gored by a boar. But the edges of the wound were black. A creeping darkness that looked like frostbite, but it pulsed with a faint, malevolent energy. This was no normal injury. This was a curse. She pushed the thought away. Curse or no curse, the treatment was the same. It needed to be cleaned. She tore a strip from the hem of her own tunic, the cleanest cloth she had. Soaking it in the icy water, she began to gently clean the wound. He let out a strangled cry, his body arching in agony. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. His grip was like iron. For a moment, all she could feel was the crushing force, the sheer power he held in check. His golden eyes blazed, no longer clouded but filled with a feral, instinctual fury. "Let go," she said, her voice shaking but steady. "I have to clean it, or the poison will kill you." She did not try to pull away. She met his gaze without flinching. She let him see the honesty in her eyes, the simple truth of her intention. Slowly, agonizingly, the pressure on her wrist eased. His fingers uncurled. He fell back, his breath coming in harsh, ragged gasps. But his eyes never left her face. He had understood. She went back to her work, her hands moving with a new sureness. She cleaned the wound as best she could, flushing it with the cold, clean water. He bore it in silence now, his body rigid, his knuckles white where he gripped the stone floor. She crushed the yarrow and plantain leaves between two stones, creating a crude poultice. She spread it carefully over the angry flesh. The moment the herbs touched the blackened edges of the wound, he cried out again, a sharp, guttural sound. A thin, black smoke, smelling of rot and winter, rose from the wound. The curse was fighting back. She worked quickly, binding the wound with fresh strips of her tunic. It was a clumsy, makeshift job, but it was the best she could do. When she was done, she sat back on her heels, exhausted. The effort had drained her completely. The hunger and cold came rushing back, a tidal wave of misery. She swayed, a wave of dizziness washing over her. A hand touched her arm. It was his. The same hand that had gripped her wrist with such violence was now surprisingly gentle. His fingers were cold, so cold, but there was a strange warmth spreading from his touch. She looked at him. The feral light in his eyes was gone, replaced by something else. A weary gratitude. He gave her a short, jerky nod, a kingly gesture even in his broken state. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he slumped into unconsciousness. The next few days blurred into a cycle of desperate survival. Ilara tended to the fire, coaxing it from embers to a steady blaze. She foraged for more herbs, for edible roots and fungi, for anything that could keep them both alive. She spooned thin, watery broth into the man's mouth when he was lucid, and dribbled water between his lips when he was lost to the fever. He was mostly lost. He thrashed and muttered in his sleep, his words a jumble of strange names and harsh commands. Sometimes the fever would break, and he would lie still, his golden eyes watching her as she moved about the small space. He never spoke. He just watched. She talked to him, though. She filled the silence with the sound of her voice, telling him about the weather, about the squirrels she had seen gathering nuts, about anything and everything. It was better than the silence. The silence was filled with the sound of his ragged breathing and the gnawing of her own hunger. On the third night, the fever peaked. He was burning up, his skin hot and dry to the touch. He writhed on his pallet of furs, soaked in sweat, his growls returning, low and constant. The blackness around his wound seemed to have spread, thin veins of it creeping up his thigh. Ilara was terrified. She had done everything she knew how to do. She had changed the poultice, forced him to drink willowbark tea, but the curse was winning. In desperation, she soaked cloths in the icy stream water and laid them on his forehead, his chest, his burning skin. She sat beside him all night, replacing the cloths as they warmed, her own body shivering with cold and exhaustion. She had given him most of her cloak, leaving herself with only her thin tunic. She must have dozed off, her head slumped against the cold stone of the hearth. She dreamed of fire, of a warmth so intense it felt like sunshine on her skin. She woke with a start. The first thing she noticed was the warmth, a gentle, pervasive heat that enveloped her. The fire in the hearth was blazing, a roaring inferno that filled the small ruin with dancing light and a comforting heat. The second thing she noticed was that she was no longer on the cold stone floor. Her makeshift bed of dry leaves and her tattered cloak had been moved. She was now lying directly in front of the hearth, only a few feet from the crackling flames. She sat up, confused. She didn't remember moving. She had been too exhausted to even crawl closer to the fire. Then she saw him. He was awake. He was sitting up, leaning against the far wall, his injured leg stretched out in front of him. He was watching her. The fever had broken. The feral light was gone from his eyes. They were still gold, but it was a clear, intelligent gold now, the color of late afternoon sun. He had done it. While she slept, he had dragged himself across the floor, his injured leg a dead weight, and moved her closer to the fire. He had stoked the flames, built them into a furnace to ward off the cold that had been threatening to claim her. He had seen her shivering. He had seen her sacrifice her own comfort for his. And in the dead of night, in a silent act of profound gratitude, he had cared for her in return. A strange feeling bloomed in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a fragile, unfamiliar thing, like a winter flower pushing its way through frozen ground. She stared at him, and he stared back. The silence stretched between them, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not empty. It was filled with unspoken words, with a shared understanding that went deeper than language. "Your fever is gone," she said, her voice soft. He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. His gaze dropped to his leg. She followed it. The angry redness around the wound had faded. The swelling had gone down, and the creeping black veins. They were still there, but they seemed fainter, less menacing. "Thank you," he said. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone, rough with disuse but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. It was a voice that was used to being obeyed. The sound of it startled her. It was the first time he had spoken a coherent word. "You would have done the same," she mumbled, looking down at her hands. It was not true. No one had ever shown her such a kindness. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not many would have. You carry the outcast's brand, yet you showed mercy to a stranger in the King's Wood. Why?" His golden eyes searched her face, and she felt stripped bare, as if he could see every scar, every fear, Every pathetic hope she harbored. I know what it is to be in pain, she whispered, her hand instinctively going to the spot on her chest where the brand was hidden beneath her tunic. And alone. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of something that looked like empathy. He seemed to understand. "What is your name?" he asked. "Ilara." He tested the name on his tongue. "Ilara," he repeated. It sounded different in his voice. It sounded like a name of significance. "I am Kaelin. Just Kaelin. Not a title, not a rank, just a name." But she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that he was more than just a wounded hunter. The authority in his voice, the power that still radiated from him even in his weakened state, the unnatural cold of his curse. This was no ordinary man. They fell into a new routine, one of quiet companionship. Kaelin was weak, but his strength returned with surprising speed. He began to help, tending the fire, sharpening a small knife he carried at his belt, his large, powerful hands moving with surprising dexterity. He still did not tell her who he was, and she did not ask. It was a fragile peace they had built in their small stone sanctuary, and she was afraid to break it with questions. She was content to live in the simple reality of the present moment. She was warm. She was not hungry. She was not alone. It was more than she had ever had. She learned to read his moods, the subtle shifts in his expression. She saw the flash of pain that crossed his face when he thought she wasn't looking, the deep weariness in his eyes that spoke of a burden far heavier than his physical injury. She saw the way he would sometimes stare into the fire, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists, as if fighting a battle within himself. The beast was still there, she realized. Not gone, just sleeping. One afternoon, a patrol of royal guards stumbled upon their refuge. There were 4 of them, clad in shining steel and the deep blue of the king's livery. They were loud and arrogant, their laughter echoing through the quiet woods. They burst into the ruin without warning, their swords drawn. "What's this, then?" The leader sneered, his eyes falling on Ilara. He saw the tattered tunic, the dirt on her face. His gaze lingered on the sliver of skin visible above the neckline of her dress. "A forest rat." Ilara froze, her heart seizing with a familiar cold fear. Kaelin moved, placing himself between her and the guards. It was a subtle movement, just a shifting of his weight, but it was a clear and unmistakable act of protection. He was still limping, but he stood tall, a formidable presence that even the armed guards could not ignore. "She is with me," Kaelin said, his voice low and dangerous. The guard captain laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Is she now? And who are you to be giving orders in the King's Wood? A poacher?" His eyes raked over Kaelin's rough clothing and bearded face. He did not recognize the king he served. "You have no business here," Kaelin stated. It was not a request. It was a command. "We have every business here," another guard said, stepping forward. He was young, with a cruel twist to his mouth. He pointed his sword at Ilara. "And we have business with her. She wears the thief's brand. The punishment for a branded criminal found in the royal woods is death." The word hit her like a physical blow. Death. "That brand was a lie," she whispered, the words torn from her throat. "They all say that, sweetheart," the young guard mocked. He took another step forward. A rage, white-hot and pure, erupted in Ilara's chest. It was a fury so intense it stole her breath. The injustice of it all, the lie of her brand, the arrogance of these men, the casual cruelty of the world, it all coalesced into a single, burning point of anger. She was so tired of being small, so tired of being afraid. "Leave her alone," Kaelin growled. The temperature in the room dropped. The fire in the hearth sputtered, the flames turning a sickly blue-white. The air grew thick, heavy with a power that made the hair on Ilara's arms stand on end. The guards felt it too. They shuffled back, their eyes wide with a sudden superstitious fear. They looked from the sputtering fire to Kaelin, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed the captain's face. "We will report this," the captain said, his voice lacking its earlier bravado. "The king will hear of it." "I am certain he will," Kaelin said, his voice like the grinding of glaciers. The guards backed away, their bravado gone, replaced by a sullen unease. They practically fled the ruin, their retreat a comical scramble of clanking armor. The moment they were gone, the oppressive power in the room vanished. The fire roared back to life, its warm orange light a welcome relief. Kaelin sagged against the wall, his face pale, a sheen of sweat on his brow. The effort had cost him. Ilara rushed to his side. "Are you all right?" He waved her off, taking deep, steadying breaths. "I am fine." He looked at her, his golden eyes searching her face. "Are you?" She nodded, though she was shaking. The rage was still simmering beneath her skin, a strange, buzzing energy she had never felt before. They would have killed me. I would not have let them," he said. The simple, absolute certainty in his voice was more comforting than any hollow promise. It was a statement of fact. Later that evening, as she was changing the poultice on his leg, she felt it. She was still agitated, the encounter with the guards replaying in her mind. The injustice of it burned. She placed her hand on his leg, her fingers brushing against his skin just above the bandage. A spark. It was tiny, a faint flicker of warmth that jumped from her skin to his. She snatched her hand back as if burned. Kaelin stiffened. "What was that?" he asked, his voice sharp. I don't know," she stammered. "I felt a shock." He looked down at his leg, then back at her, a strange, thoughtful expression on his face. "Do it again," he commanded softly. Hesitantly, she reached out and placed her palm flat against his leg. This time, she was ready for it. She focused on the simmering anger inside her, on the memory of the guard's sneering face. And she focused on Kaelin, on the quiet strength of the man who had stood between her and death. The warmth bloomed beneath her hand, stronger this time. It was not just her own body heat. It was a flow of energy, a river of life pouring from her into him. She could feel it, a tingling in her veins, a strange hum in her bones. Under her palm, she could feel the muscles of his leg twitch, not in pain, but in response. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. He was staring at his leg, his expression one of utter astonishment. "The cold," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "It's receding." She could feel it too. The unnatural chill that always clung to him was lessening, pushed back by the steady flow of warmth from her hand. The black, cursed veins under his skin seemed to shrink, to pull back from her touch like shadows from a flame. What was this? What was she doing? This was her power. Her rage at the injustice had not been the power itself, but the key that had unlocked the door. And the power. It had nothing to do with her alone. It was a circuit. It flowed from her, but it was his own life force, his own fading power, that it was amplifying and feeding back into him. It was a bond. He looked at her, and the wonder in his eyes was breathtaking. He saw her, not as a branded outcast, not as a forest rat, but as a miracle. Ilara, he breathed her name, and it was a prayer. For weeks, they existed in this new reality. Every day she would place her hands on him, and he would guide her, telling her where the cold was strongest, where the curse held its tightest grip. The process left her drained but strangely exhilarated, and it left him stronger. The limp lessened, the color returned to his face. The haunted look in his eyes was replaced by a steady, growing hope. They talked. He told her of the curse, an ancient blight laid upon his bloodline by a vengeful witch centuries ago. It lay dormant for generations, but it had woken in him, a slow, creeping decay that leached his strength, his warmth, his very life. It had been slowly turning him into the beast the legend spoke of, a cold, feral creature of instinct and rage. "You stopped it," he told her one evening, his hand covering hers where it rested on his leg. "You are pushing it back." He still hadn't told her he was the king, but she knew. She saw it in the way he carried himself, in the depth of his knowledge about the kingdom and its politics, in the sheer force of his will. Their fragile peace was shattered by a vision. It came one night as they sat by the fire. Elara felt a sudden piercing cold, a cold that had nothing to do with the night air. The fire dwindled to a single pale flame. Kaelin gasped, clutching his chest, his face contorted in agony. In the flickering, dying light, a figure shimmered into existence in the center of the room. It was a woman, ancient and terrible. Her face a mask of cruel beauty, her eyes chips of black ice. It was the witch, Morwenna. "So," the witch hissed, her voice like the cracking of ice. "The last of the line of Eredor finds himself a little plaything, a little ember to warm his frozen bones." Her gaze fell on Elara, and it was a physical weight, crushing and malevolent. A little branded thief with a spark of the old blood in her. How quaint! "Leave her out of this, Morwenna," Kaelin snarled, struggling to his feet. "Oh, I think not." The witch laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "She is the most interesting part of this game. She is a loose thread, and I have come to snip it." She raised a long, skeletal hand. A bolt of black energy, the very essence of the cold that had plagued Kaelin, shot towards Elara. Kaelin moved faster than she could have believed possible. He threw himself in front of her, taking the full force of the blast. He did not cry out. He simply stiffened, a terrible rigidity seizing his body. A layer of frost spread across his clothes, his hair, his skin. His golden eyes, fixed on Elara's, widened in shock and pain, and then the light within them flickered and died, replaced by a dull, frozen haze. He fell to the floor like a felled tree, no longer a man, but a statue of ice. "He chose you over his life," Morwenna sneered. "A foolish, sentimental choice. And now, the curse will finish what it started. He will be a frozen monument to my power by sunrise." The witch faded, her cruel laughter echoing in the sudden, absolute silence. Elara stared at Kaelin's frozen form, her mind a screaming void. He was gone. He had sacrificed himself for her. No. The word was a silent scream in her soul. No. She scrambled to his side, her hands touching his face. He was colder than stone, colder than the winter earth, the life, the warmth. The man she had come to, care for, was gone. A wave of grief so powerful it threatened to shatter her washed over Elara. But beneath the grief, the old, familiar rage began to stir. The injustice, the sheer, utter unfairness of it all. The witch had made a mistake. She had threatened the one good thing in Elara's life. She had tried to snuff out the one spark of hope she had ever known. And now, she would learn what it was to stand against a fire. Kaelin's men found them an hour later. The patrol captain, his face grim, had followed his instincts and returned with reinforcements. They found their king, encased in a shell of magical ice, and a wild-eyed girl who refused to leave his side. They took him to the castle. The journey was a blur to Elara. She was a ghost, moving through a world that had lost its color. The great stone fortress of Silverwood Keep was a place of chaos. Courtiers whispered in shadowed corners. Healers and mages came and went from the king's chambers, their faces grim. Elara was treated as a prisoner. She was locked in a small, cold chamber, but she barely noticed. Her entire being was focused on the man lying in the state bed, a man growing colder with every passing moment. A treacherous advisor, a man named Lord Valerius, who had served Kaelin's father, tried to have her sent away. Or worse. He saw her as a complication, a low-born distraction. "The king is dying," he said to her, his voice slick with false sympathy. His condition is beyond your understanding. You should leave this place. I will not, she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. She had been brought before the council, a collection of grim-faced lords and ladies who looked at her as if she were an insect. She met Valerius's gaze. I am the only one who can help him. He laughed. You? A branded thief? What can you do that the most powerful mages in the kingdom cannot? I can give him warmth, she said simply. They let her stay, if only because they had run out of other options. She was allowed into the king's chambers, a vast, cold room dominated by the enormous bed where he lay. He was a figure from a nightmare, his skin pale and translucent, a layer of frost clinging to his eyelashes. The great fire roaring in the hearth could not touch the chill that emanated from him. She sat by his side day and night, her hand resting on his icy arm. She poured all of her focus, all of her will, into that single point of contact. She pushed her warmth, her life, her energy into the bond that still connected them, a faint, flickering thread in a sea of encroaching cold. It was not enough. He was getting colder. On the third night, Morwenna came for her. Ilara was dozing in her chair, her head resting on the edge of the bed. She woke to the scent of winter and rot. The witch stood at the foot of the bed, a smug, triumphant smile on her face. It is almost over, Morwenna hissed. His fire is nearly extinguished, and now it is your turn. She held up a small, dark vial. A simple poison, painless. You will simply go to sleep and never wake up. A mercy, really. Far kinder than the death he is suffering. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced Ilara's heart. She was alone. The guards outside were oblivious. No one could help her. Morwenna moved closer, her eyes gleaming. Do not struggle. It will only make it worse. As the witch reached for her, a desperate, primal scream built in Ilara's chest. A scream for help. A scream of defiance. A scream for Kaelin. And through the bond, he heard her. Deep within the frozen prison of his own body, a single ember of consciousness remained, an ember that was wholly focused on her. He felt her terror as if it were his own. He felt the presence of the witch, the threat to the one person who had ever seen the man behind the beast. And the Alpha King awoke. It was not a gentle waking, it was a volcanic eruption of will and power. The ice that encased him did not melt, it shattered. A shockwave of pure force exploded from the bed, throwing Morwenna across the room. Ilara. His voice was a roar, a thunderclap that shook the very foundations of the castle. His golden eyes blazed with a light so intense it was blinding. He was on his feet, no longer a broken, dying man, but a king in his full, terrible glory. He was still weak. The effort was killing him. She could feel his life force draining away at a terrifying rate. But he stood between her and the witch. Morwenna scrambled to her feet, her face a mask of shock and fury. Impossible! You are nothing but a dying man. I am her shield, Kaelin growled, his voice dropping to a low, possessive rumble. He took a step, and the floorboards groaned under his weight. He was a force of nature, a storm about to break. He swayed, a hand going to his chest. The power was too much. The curse was tearing him apart from the inside. He looked at Ilara, and in his blazing eyes she saw it all. The desperation, the fear of losing her, the love. I love you, he gasped, the words torn from him, a confession made under the threat of imminent death. And it's going to kill me. He collapsed to his knees, his power flickering like a dying candle. Morwenna laughed, a triumphant, cackling sound. Such a romantic tragedy. Now, to end it. She raised her hands, gathering the cold, dark energy for a final killing blow. But as Kaelin fell, Ilara rose. His words, his sacrifice, his love. They had not broken her. They had forged her. The grief, the rage, the fear, the desperate, aching love she felt for him. It all came together, not as a spark, but as an inferno. She knew what she had to do. Her power was not a weapon, it was an amplifier. It could not create, but it could magnify. And she was bonded to the most powerful man in the kingdom. She ran to him, falling to her knees before him. She placed her hands on his chest, over his fading heart. She ignored the witch, ignored the gathering darkness. She focused only on him. "I will not let you die," she whispered, her voice fierce. "You are mine." She closed her eyes and pushed. She did not just send warmth. She sent everything. Her memories, her hopes, her fears, her soul. She poured herself into the bond, a willing sacrifice. She would not let him face the darkness alone. She would join him there, and they would fight their way out together, or they would perish as one. The power that erupted from them was not fire, and it was not ice. It was light, pure, golden, unadulterated light. It was the light of a king's fading power, amplified 1,000-fold by the love of a woman who refused to let him go. It flooded the room, a cleansing wave of pure energy. It struck Morwenna, and the witch screamed, a sound of pure agony as the light burned away the centuries of cold and darkness that made up her being. She dissolved into a cloud of black dust, her curse shattering with her. The light filled every corner of the castle, pouring out of the windows, a beacon of hope in the night. Every wolf in the kingdom felt it, a surge of strength and life through their own pack bonds. The land itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. In the center of it all, Elara held Kaelin, her body slumped against his. The light faded, leaving them in the quiet aftermath. She felt a hand, warm and strong, cup the back of her head. "Liar," a deep voice murmured against her hair. She looked up. Kaelin was looking down at her, his golden eyes clear and bright and filled with an emotion so powerful it stole her breath. The last vestiges of the curse, of the cold, were gone. He was whole. "You said loving you would kill you," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "I was wrong," he said, his voice soft. "Loving you was the only thing that could save me." He leaned down and kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperation or fear. It was a kiss of homecoming, of promises kept, of a new world dawning. 3 months later, Elara stood on the balcony of the king's chambers, looking out over the city. The sun was warm on her face. A heavy, fur-lined cloak, the color of the royal blue, was draped over her shoulders. She was no longer cold. Strong arms wrapped around her from behind, pulling her back against a solid, warm chest. Kaelin rested his chin on her shoulder, his breath warm against her ear. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured. "I was thinking about a foolish girl, freezing to death in the woods," she said softly. His arms tightened around her. "That girl saved a kingdom." She turned in his arms, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. She looked up into his face, into the golden eyes that had once been filled with so much pain and were now filled only with love for her. "No," she said, a smile touching her lips. "She saved a man. The man saved his kingdom." He traced the line of her jaw with a gentle finger, his touch sending a familiar warmth through her. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "We saved each other," he said. And it was the simplest, most profound truth in the world. She looked past him, at their reflection in the glass of the balcony doors. A king and his queen, a beast and his flame. 2 broken halves made whole, standing together against the coming dawn. Her hand went to her collarbone, to the place where the brand had been. The mark was still there, a faint, silvery scar. It no longer felt like a brand of shame. It was a reminder of the cold she had come from, and of the incredible, impossible warmth she had found. It was a part of her story. And her story, she realized, was only just beginning.